Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the virtual Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center. We're glad that you can join us for our discussion of the centenary celebrations of China's Communist Party. This is the one program that I know of which is actually being held on the true centenary of the party. There's been a little bit of revision within China. The celebrations began on July 1st. But 100 years ago, it was actually on this date, on July 23rd, that Mao Zedong and several other revolutionaries met in Shanghai to launch the work of the Chinese Communist Party. We are going to focus today on the way that that event has been sold and described by the Chinese Communist Party to the Chinese people and also to the rest of the world. How does the party tell its history? There's been some evolution on that front since Xi Jinping became the general secretary. And most importantly, what kinds of promises is China making to its people and secondarily to the rest of the world as it moves forward? These questions of propaganda, messaging, soft power are a major focus of the Kissinger Institute, and that has been reflected to our great fortune through the Wilson Fellows that have come to us over the years. And we're very happy today to be able to focus on the work of two of them in particular. We are going to begin with Maria Repnikova of Georgia State University, who is familiar to many of you. She's been featured on a lot of our work over the past year. And she's been focusing on China's propaganda efforts, soft power efforts, especially in Africa, but internationally through her research here. And we've asked her to lead off by talking about the way that China is trying to position the centenary to the rest of the world and how it's trying to use it to tell China's story, as Xi Jinping says. And Maria is finishing up her, for her 1 year here as a Wilson Fellow. She will be followed by Anne-Marie Brady, who was a fellow here in the 2013-2014 academic year. She was working that year primarily on polar issues, China's policies in the Arctic and Antarctic, but she's also one of the world's leading experts on Chinese propaganda. And it was her article on China's magic weapons, the United Front, that was published in September in 2017 by the Kissinger Institute, which I think more than any other one publication really helped ring the alarm bells about China's overseas influence activities. That's work that has brought her to the attention of Beijing in ways that have been extremely difficult, but we're very glad to have Anne-Marie back with us today. We were also to have been joined by a third Wilson Fellow, Ann Kokas, author of Hollywood Made in China, who was conducting research here at the Wilson Center in 2017, 2018. She is unfortunately unable to join us today, but we promise to bring her back to you, either here virtually or in person when we can do so sometime in the coming year. So again, welcome. I'm going to ask Maria to kick it off, and please feel free to send questions at any point during the presentations. You may send your questions via email to china@wilsoncenter.org. Again, that's china@wilsoncenter.org, and we hope to have a chance to ask your question here live in the program. If you would like it to be asked anonymously, please say so in your email. Thank you. Maria Repnikova, would you lead us off, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. And it's wonderful to be speaking from the Wilson office, even though soon my fellowship is ending, but it's been a pleasure to be here for this past year. So there's been a lot of English language coverage in Chinese state media outlets dedicated to the 100th anniversary. The techniques used in reporting on the anniversary echo external propaganda strategies that I've observed in my previous research on this topic. Domestically, the coverage celebrates the party as having both a record of past success and a hopeful future trajectory. The propaganda messaging also attempts to tell the story of China as a global power by engaging foreign experts and politicians who legitimize China's global standing. So first of all, there's the presentation of the evolution of the party state in a linear manner: struggles overcome by victories, poverty by development, humiliation by greatness. An excerpt from China Daily Report reads as the following: through a century of endeavors, the CPC led the people to overthrow the, quote, the three big mountains of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, founded a new China, pioneered the path of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and built a poor state into the world's second largest economy. The messaging deliberately avoids any mistakes made on this path towards greatness or about any ongoing struggles and tensions, either domestically or internationally, that the party is still trying to manage and address. The party is also presented as future-oriented or is confident in ruling China for the unforeseeable future. Today, it is rallying and leading the Chinese people on a new journey toward realizing the second centenary goal, proclaimed Xi Jinping in his widely televised and publicized speech. So this idea that this 100-year anniversary is just the beginning, right? It's due to reach 200-year anniversary in the future. So it's really just kind of this teleological long-term view of the party. Much of this future orientation and hopefulness is also expressed through selective interviews with Chinese public. A clip that I watched on CGTN, for instance, interviews Chinese residents in Beijing who all express positive hopes for the future, including regarding China's technological development, expansion, education, but also confidence in China's path being the correct path, and Chinese leadership described as effective and, quote, down to earth. This use of public sentiment and quotes and participation in propaganda, I think it's a very widespread technique that we see in Chinese media reporting domestically and internationally. We saw this especially during the pandemic, when a lot of reports about kind of the victory over the virus featured the voices of nurses, delivery workers, doctors, and everyday residents who kind of came together in this unified campaign to beat the pandemic. So I think that's something that we often see as it's not just the party voices coming out, the official voices, it's really the people speaking. And there's been a significant effort to make that the centerpiece of the propaganda, both towards external audiences, but also domestically. The external messaging also presents the CCP as a globally legitimate power through the voices of foreign leaders and experts in the form of opinion pieces, interviews, and congratulatory messages featured on Chinese social media. The array of foreign voices is quite diverse, from the former Prime Minister for Bosnia and Herzegovina to an Indian journalist contributor to a number of professors and journalist voices from Africa, including Kenya and Zambia, to messages from Vladimir Putin. So this kind of delegation of propaganda to various foreign actors, I think it's been one of the most widespread techniques, again, over time, but also during this particular anniversary celebration. The messaging that I've read by foreign experts varies in emphasis and scope. Some share relatively balanced remarks about China's success story. Others indirectly suggest that China is now serving as a harmonious global unifying force. The former Prime Minister for Bosnia, for instance, noted that the anniversary is a good moment to reflect about global unity and shared challenges. Some commentaries, especially from Africa, directly invoke the lessons that China's developmental trajectory offers for African countries, including the importance of stability and economic prosperity for successful development. A strong political party is necessary to win the war against poverty, writes Professor Kagwanja at the University of Nairobi. Another African scholar, Athiri Kavinchi, rebukes Western fears about China's rise with a narrative of appreciation for China's help and support in the global South. Beijing has provided a new impetus for other emerging economies on what is possible when the government and people unite to confront enduring challenges. Under the leadership of the CCP, China is actively extending the proceeds of its development to other countries in a spirit of shared prosperity, he writes. And this notion of kind of invoking these voices from the African continent to support and to celebrate China's accomplishments is something that we don't only see again in this kind of particular moment of anniversary celebration, but also throughout China's engagement in Africa, both historically and in the contemporary period. In particular, in my research, I also looked at African journalists, coming to China for trainings and for long-term fellowships, where they're not required but asked to write stories, for Chinese media. And those stories that tend to come out as opinion pieces or as separate kind of reportage, that they tend to be very positive. So there are no negative stories that come out, from these individuals visiting, even though they may have some negative perceptions, they wouldn't be expressing them publicly. So it's quite a bit of engagement, that's kind of positive storytelling through these trainees who come to China. And this technique, of course, of delegating Chinese image promotion to foreign experts has also been examined, I think, very skillfully and very extensively in Professor Brady's book. So I'm sure she will also have a lot to say about this use of foreign guests, right, for propaganda purposes, a historic technique that I think is really significant. And incidentally, just before this anniversary, China Daily has set up the Edgar Snow newsroom in an effort to attract more foreign journalists and experts to report, again, on kind of the right story, right, the correct story of China. But of course, the kind of journalists they expect to come and report would, in some ways, mimic Edgar Snow, who was, of course, overwhelmingly positive, right, storyteller of China in the Mao era. So who is willing to tell those stories? I think that's a question that we may, be interested in debating, but it's not usually Western reporters working for professional news outlets, but oftentimes it is journalists and experts from Global South who have certain incentives to tell those stories through these various trainings, but also as part of their reporting at large. So are these propaganda techniques effective? it is hard to determine how effective the celebratory messages were for China's global image promotion. The discursive promotion of China by international actors might resonate with domestic Chinese audiences, as these messages make China appear as more globally acceptable and even inspiring to some countries. When it comes to international perceptions, though, I think the messaging around the anniversary is unlikely to dramatically shift perceptions one way or another. The more favorable audiences, including some elites in the global South, are already symbolically and materially aligned with China. The less favorable audiences in the West are likely to perceive these messages as grandiose propaganda and as further evidence of threatening ambitions of the party state, especially when it comes to this future-oriented notion of celebrating another anniversary in a 100-year time. Some Western publics, especially on social media, have also used Chinese messaging around the anniversary to post sarcastic remarks to kind of rebuke propaganda. Xinhua is proud to post congratulatory messages from fellow authoritarian regimes, writes one post. Congratulations on 100 years of forced depopulation. Really amazing work you did, reads another post. Some groups, such as the International Students Organization, who are currently stuck outside of China, unable to return due to various restrictions, have also used the anniversary as an opportunity to raise awareness about their struggles, to kind of lobby the Chinese government to do something about their status as being unable to return and continue their education in China. One intriguing aspect to me that was missing from this Chinese reportage on the anniversary is any kind of clear articulation of the party's global vision, what kind of power it really sees itself as evolving into, and what offerings it makes for the world as it moves beyond 100 years in power. The ambiguous rhetoric about community of shared destiny and harmonious future is unlikely to assuage the anxious publics in the West, who increasingly see China solely as a competitive force to be reckoned with, or even as a threat, rather than as a partner in a joint project of constructing a hopeful and sustainable global future. Thank you.
Thanks. Maria, you focused a lot on what you called the global South and on African voices, where there seems to be some receptivity to these messages. We had a Pew poll at the end of June of 17 advanced economies, among which, with the exception of Singapore, views of China are still trending ever more negative. Trust of Xi Jinping as a decision maker is very low, and views of the United States since the election of Joe Biden seem to be going up, although they're not quite what they once were. So there seems to be this stark division between the advanced economies and the developing world. Two questions about that. One is, do you also hear more skeptical voices within especially Africa, which has been the focus of your research? How mixed is the discourse there? And then secondly, is China in its soft power and propaganda efforts, is it writing off the advanced economies? Is it focused primarily on the global South, or do they not do segmentation of that kind? I'd just be interested in your views on those issues, and then we'll go to Anne-Marie.
Sure, thank you so much for these questions, Robert. First of all, in terms of skeptical voices in Africa, absolutely, there is a lot of skepticism. I think public opinion polls, they're very imperfect tools for capturing public sentiments, because they do tend to ask questions in a certain way, and only some individuals are willing to respond to them. But when you look at this kind of questions from a different perspective through interviews, focus groups, observations, you see kind of different types of sentiments coming out. Even the elites, say from Ethiopia, which was the case that I've worked on, more extensively, who tend to be very closely aligned with China on paper and in terms of their public speeches, they would also reflect, on the sentiment of, some admiration, of course, for China's trajectory and appreciation for China's engagement in Ethiopia and economic domains, but also skepticism about, the China model, whatever that even means or entails. How applicable is it to their context? Most of them would say it's not actually as applicable, and they have to learn from different places and not just from China. But also skepticism about the nature of kind of Chinese domestic political governance. After coming to China for trainings, on the one hand, one sees this grandiose China that's extremely, accomplished and developed. On the other hand, you're not able to ask sensitive questions to your trainers and hosts, right? So these meetings are very much controlled in terms of their agenda by the Chinese parties, and it's really difficult to ask things about, sustainability of Chinese projects in Ethiopia, or environmental impact, or labor rights. Those kind of questions are met with silence, and it leaves participants with also this very mixed sentiment. Like, is it really, are they really welcomed, and is it really an open conversation? For the most part, it's not. It's a public diplomacy kind of a spectacle. So that creates, I think, a mixed perception there. But there's also an important distinction, I think, between the public kind of society at large versus elites. And I think that's true for many places, not only in African context, but maybe global South at large, where if you speak to ordinary citizens who work, daily kind of routine jobs, who are not in politics, for instance, but they're observing Chinese projects on the ground, most of them would not express very positive sentiments about these projects, which always kind of struck me sometimes it's a bit surprising, when you see those newly built highways or train system and so forth, but the first comment will be almost always negative. The roads are already flooded, or the train is not working quickly enough, or it's really expensive, the loans are hard to repay. There's a lot of critique and kind of confusion, but also worry about Chinese community presence in their country. Like how sustainable is this? Are they coming to sort of stay forever? The sentiment of isolation culturally from this community, and what are their aims and goals in Ethiopia? So I would say that there is actually quite a bit of fear as well, not only skepticism in terms of public opinion at large, not only elites. And the second, I think, question, if I understood correctly, was about segmentation, right, of propaganda. Is there kind of a distinct approach to the global South? I think there is a little bit from what I heard from so-called propagandists themselves. I mean, I would just call them journalists, right, who work for party media. They would say that the reports on Chinese projects, in particular infrastructure projects and developmental kind of goals, they seem to think that these reports are more appreciated in the African context. For instance, they emphasize those topics a lot more, as opposed to maybe more cultural topics or maybe softer stories that they seem to try to, target the Western audience with. But also, I think that when it comes to wolf warrior diplomacy, of course, that's sparked up so much now in the West, you see a little bit of that in the African context, but less, because I think there's less provocative kind of coverage unless they're being provoked in the first place. So for the most part, it's still very balanced, kind of very positive messaging that tends to come out in this reporting. But also it's important to note that Global South and Africa in particular is not really the focus of external propaganda. It's of course, it's often talked about so much, especially in Washington, China's presence in Africa, but most resources are not directed there, they're directed towards the West. So it's not as widely resourced, even though they have a big symbolic presence, and most journalists who end up going to Africa are very young, less experienced than the ones who end up going to, say, to the US. So that's something I wanted to note.
Sorry. For our audience, if you have any questions about China's either domestic or international propaganda connected to the centenary or otherwise, please send them to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. We now go to Professor Anne-Marie Brady of the University of Canterbury. Anne-Marie, good to have you back with the Wilson Center.
Tēnā koutou katoa, warm Pacific greetings. It's really wonderful to join you all. It's 7:18 on the Saturday morning here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I have very fond memories of my time in Washington, DC, and I'm actually excited I'll be back there again next year as a fellow, but not with Wilson Center, with your comrades over at NED. So I wanted to, first of all, give a little bit of a background to the modern propaganda system in China, because in English, propaganda has a very negative connotation. And it does in Chinese, if you were saying that's just propaganda, 那就是宣传. But if you're the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, 宣传 is a normal task of government. In fact, they call it the lifeblood of the party. And so, the CCP is sensitive to the ways in which propaganda, the meaning that it has in English and other languages. So for foreign language speakers, they have translated the name for the main party organization that oversees the modernized propaganda system, that in Chinese, the name does indeed mean the Central Propaganda Department, but in English it's called the Central Publicity Department. So that's the first thing to say, is that we're talking about propaganda, and people might listen and think, Maria talked about the propagandists. People might think, is this some kind of bias about China? The CCP uses this language, and the CCP talks about people in the party doing propaganda work. So this is the language that we work with when we look at China's information management and efforts to shape public opinion and monitor what can and can't be said in China. And the parameters on that have really, really changed under Xi Jinping, as I think many people have noticed. So as I said, the propaganda is called the lifeblood of the party, is absolutely essential for the party's hold on power. And it was really underestimated. And I think many scholars believe that it was weak and failing in at least both inside China and outside China in the post-Cultural Revolution period. And Maria, you talked about how effective propaganda the message is, and that was something that many questioned. And people also questioned the effectiveness of the Central Propaganda Department to manage China's modernized, commercialized media. But famously, as one of the great scholars of China's mass communication says, Zhao Yuezhi, the Chinese media is between the party line and the bottom line. And all forms of mass communication, anything that's invented is going to be incorporated into the propaganda system. And the propaganda system, or Xitong, is vast. It covers everything from news media to sport, to health. So the COVID messaging is also part of the propaganda system. So this is a vast system to manage public opinion in China, or manage the public sphere. And all those outlets are meant to sing with one voice. We did see some more diversity in the era of Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, but in the Xi era, it seems that no critique is acceptable. And we saw this very much in the anniversary celebrations. And the CCP historically has had a sharp divide between the Waixue and the foreign propaganda and the message targeted at the Chinese population. But that is less obvious these days, because foreigners can access the messaging in China, although that is being restricted to some extent. Some of us who do research on the CCP are finding that websites are being blocked to outsiders. But you can access the newspapers, you can watch the TV shows. So we're also, the messaging between domestic and foreign, and I think Maria's touched on that too, is more similar these days than it used to be, because the party can't completely hide what it's trying to say. For Chinese speakers who are watching and assessing China's what China is saying. So the CCP's propaganda system, the task of it is to present China as united and powerful and standing behind the party. We really saw this in the 100th anniversaries. Now, I've been researching it, as Robert said, for about China's modernized, another modernized system, which is the maritime Xitong, the Haiyang Xitong. And in doing that research, I read about these important dates, 2021 and 2049, and the 100 anniversaries. And in the research that I did over 6 years ago now, I read that China was going to, in 2021, have a 小康社会. It's going to have a prosperous society. And so what do you know? The 100th anniversary propaganda tells us that China has indeed reached that target. So whether they did or not, they had to, because that is what the party messaging has been saying. So we saw in the domestic messaging on how the success of China was very much a result of the work of the party, and that China had met its performance goals. It was also a very defiant message. We had that famous line, anyone who dares to try to confront China will have their heads bashed bloody against the Great Wall of Steel forged by over 1.4 billion. I don't recall seeing any rhetoric like that before, and I'd be interested to know your perspective on this, Robert and Maria. But that is really, really strong message for the CCP. They're very defiant. It was in fact, quite a defensive speech, essentially, because China actually isn't really where it wants to be, or the CCP isn't where it wants to be, especially with COVID. It should have been a huge propaganda success, the 100th anniversary. There should have been international leaders there. They should have had scores of message of praise. In fact, China Daily said that they collected 30 messages of praise. I saw a few of them. They were pretty pro forma. It's very different from the 90th anniversary of the CCP, where many Western leaders sent effusive messages of praise. and also attended the celebrations. So another theme that was very noticeable in the 100th anniversary propaganda directed towards the Chinese population is Xi Jinping as the core leader. We saw from his clothes that he adopted very much the Mao era clothing, his posture, his hair, and so many of the programs and the events highlighting the importance of Xi Jinping. And this again is a departure from recent years, where the message after the Cultural Revolution that the party had was of one of collective leadership and not putting one leader above all. It was meant to be, the lesson was learnt from the Mao era. So this is a major departure that has happened under Xi Jinping. And one more thing I want to talk about is the big party history campaign, which is definitely directed towards foreigners and towards the domestic audience. You know, foreigners could have a look at it. There was some information about some heroic foreigners who helped and served the party, like Edgar Snow, for example. But the main message was on the model and heroic people who worked with the party in that 100-year history. There were a lot of revolutionary dramas on TV and films. There was red tourism. There was even dedicated social media to try and get youth interested in these issues. It's a big political study campaign for the Chinese population. And that's probably disconnects with a lot of people's lives, I would say, in everyday China, because it's, the party hasn't done this kind of mass information, mass political information to the Chinese population for a long time. The focus has been on spiritual civilization, is what the party calls it. So that sort of messages about being a good citizen and looking after your family and social cohesion. So we see a real, just as was said right at the beginning of Xi Jinping coming to power, how much he is taking China backwards when it comes to ideology and propaganda. And that is, really is quite a surprise backward turn. And we have to note, the very unusual conditions and what the anniversary was held under, the COVID conditions, and how much that was elided in the messaging too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'd like to just quickly touch on one of your final points, which is that a lot of young Chinese especially have never seen anything like this before. They've never seen an onslaught of propaganda and messaging. And this is a very different generation. Chinese are, as nearly as we can tell, more nationalistic, but also more sophisticated, more exposed to different kinds of messaging from within China and from without. Do we know anything yet about how they respond to a lot of this old style propaganda, which even in Chinese can just be mind-numbingly repetitive and wooden in the language? There's still calls to emulate Lei Feng. There seems to be a disconnect there. Do we know anything about the response to this from people who haven't seen it before? And have you seen, because I know you've been following Chinese propaganda for a long time, do you see any response in wording or messaging from the propaganda ministries reflecting an understanding of a more sophisticated, internationalized, technically savvy, if nationalistic populace? Are they changing their language, or are they just going to go with the same old sort of commie speak version of Chinese?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd be interested in Maria's perspective on this as well. But I have been struck by how the messages that were meant for party members, in which party members engage with in a pro forma kind of way in previous big political campaigns, like in 2005, there's a really big political campaign to try and find all these lost party members because of the economic reform, work units had been disestablished, people were made redundant, the whole party cell network was broken down. And there was a big party progressiveness campaign then, and people did things like they had to write essays to respond to the party messaging, and you could download them from the internet, a standard version. So people were very, participated in it, but it was something that was kind of laughable. But the messaging, that the party members have to take things much more seriously now under Xi Jinping, but the public also has to receive these kind of messages. And the standard wisdom had been in the 90s that the party doesn't need to do that to the population, that's counterproductive, that will be off-putting, and that the public won't engage with that kind of message. That's what China's mass communications specialists have been advising for the last couple of decades, is to adjust the party's messaging towards the population and find something that they can connect to. And for example, the Beijing Olympics slogans were directed towards the Chinese population, were not political at all. They were very mild about sort of participating and belonging. So I think that when we see the very nationalistic statements of the Chinese public, that people have got their political masks on again, I would doubt that those messages really do resonate with a lot of people. And however, I think that just like people in our society, people are very afraid because of COVID and other things, like terrible floods and and many other disasters that are happening, that people are vulnerable to frightening messages about the outside world and narration of how things have happened. So that's a different, you were talking about the party messaging and what the party is doing, but propaganda message includes essentially disinformation about news events such as where did COVID come from? The Chinese population have been told that COVID could well have come from experiments done in Fort Meade. Or it could come from frozen fish from New Zealand. New Zealand's one of about 8 countries whose frozen fish exports have been banned from China because China's pretending that COVID may have come from my country or Russia or Indonesia. And they're completely not engaging with the mismanagement of the COVID outbreak in Wuhan from late 2019 and into early 2020, which has led to the global pandemic. So the propaganda people may be receptive to this interpretation of events because they're looking to understand them and they may not have alternative sources of information. But I do wonder whether or not the political messages really connect to people because the party's own information was that it doesn't, and that they should only direct them towards party members.
Thank you. As I said, Ann Kokas was to have joined us today, is very sorry that she can't, but she did send on to me some of her notes and thoughts. I'd like to touch on those briefly because we had asked her to speak about film and television in connection with the centenary, and she had done a lot of work on that. I should note also that China's propaganda efforts are not only limited to now traditional media, film and television. They're very active online. Very famously, party members take a daily quiz of studying the works of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, and they can get points for what they do on these various apps. So that is all going on online as well. Anne was focusing on television and radio, and one of her major findings is just the degree, not surprising here, to which nothing was left to chance. Planning for narrative storytelling, visual media storytelling, was deep, and it started early. China's National Radio and Television Administration back in 2020 first ordered the industry to start producing content for the centenary. But it wasn't just about content. They also had specific policies and goals to guarantee high attendance at movie theaters and to spur up good reviews, particularly online. So that was all a part of the plan. It was announced in 2020 that more than 100 key works would be produced to commemorate the 100th anniversary, and that these would be released throughout 2021, beginning in April and through the end of the year. So this is ongoing. It wasn't simply an early July effort. It will lead up to Beijing's hosting of the Winter Olympics, Without question, it leads into a big party meeting in the end of 2022, at which, among other things, Xi Jinping is likely to cement his status as China's leader for life, for as long as he would like to lead. Every major film and television production company in China has participated in this effort, and every movie theater has been ordered to screen at least 2 propaganda films per week, beginning in April through the end of the year. So this is ubiquitous. The themes of some documentary, but many narrative, long-form dramas on television, 20-part, 100-part, soap operatic treatments of major themes, and then major films. They touch on loving the party, loving the nation, loving socialism, and very importantly, on not drawing any distinction between the party, the nation, and socialism. And then a very large push on promoting Xi Jinping thought, and therefore indirectly Xi himself. One of the major messages repeated is to follow the party forever, beyond the foreseeable future. And this, Maria and Anne-Marie, jump in anytime. I think that this forever, this infinite quality, this is a new theme, or at least a relatively new theme, looking into an infinite future of following the party. It's been implicit, but it's explicit now. The party is presented as unstoppable and is inseparable from the people and the nation. Xi Jinping has been resurrecting the old line that only socialism can save China. Without the Communist Party, there is no new China. But this discourse of saving China runs throughout. And this is interesting, that salvation is still a major theme. You've got the victimhood narrative, and then there's a victory narrative, side by side. The party as China as history's victim and hero. And with the victimhood still very much part of the discourse, even though it's largely celebratory of the many victories and the long distance that the party has come under the party, that China has come under the party's leadership, salvation is still necessary. Youth and children's programming is a big part of the television and film effort. One of the most famous of these efforts is the film 1921, which is about the young men meeting in Shanghai on this day, the very young men. It's been controversial within China itself. I wish I could show you the poster. It's clearly based on BTS, Korean and Chinese boy bands. In fact, they hired the people who play, Mao Zedong and a lot of the other leaders are TikTok stars. They're new folks to appeal to the teenagers and above. And there's sort of a boy band vibe to this whole telling of the story of China's founding fathers. And that aspect of it has actually been criticized within China itself. As part of its preparations for the propaganda rollouts this year, the Chinese government set up a hotline at which citizens could report any online comments in the Chinese cybersphere or any other cultural phenomenon that were part of his party called nihilism, which means tellings of Chinese history that are at odds with the official historiography. Party reserves absolute right to a monopoly on historical interpretation in the areas in which it wishes to have it. When 1921 hit the theaters on July 1st, there were a lot of reports to the line saying that having all these sort of young pretty boy singers play the great men of the Communist Party was itself a form of historical nihilism. So people have been using some of these methods against the people who are generating the propaganda. Another major theme on film and television that was touched on lately was China's growing military prowess. There is a martial feel to a lot of these shows, a big increase in patriotic wartime blockbusters, and not just fantastic stuff like Wolf Warrior and Wolf Warrior 2, but in 2020, the number one which is stand high. Upcoming films include the Battle of Chosin River. We're going to see more of China triumphing over the United States in the Korean War. River is directed by Chen Kai-ge, who we haven't heard from much, but you may remember him from Farewell, My Concubine. He's one of the famous fifth generation directors. Yellow. He's now doing the Americans propaganda films for China. Other films also depict battles against Western powers. There's one coming up called The Sacrifice, Glory and Dream. This is a major theme. There's another new theme that we're seeing that we haven't really seen as much of in the film and television sphere so much. And you touched on this, Anne-Marie, in speaking about Xi Jinping's announcement that they wiped out extreme poverty right on schedule. And that is that in March of last year, 2020, the National Radio and Television Administration announced there would be a new genre of film and television series called Fupinju, poverty alleviation dramas, a new genre. And there's a very popular one now called Minning Town, which actually is getting a lot of viewership within China. This is a new theme that I think we'll see continuing, overcoming poverty. There have also been films on the pandemic, the most famous of which is called Chinese Doctors, which was released on July 9th. So how about reception of film and television? Well, they don't have a rating system like Nielsen in China, so it can be tough to know. Word of mouth on WeChat, everybody knows what the big shows are, but we don't have Nielsen style ratings. We do have box office data for films to date. And here, I think the success of the Centennial films has been fair to middling. The #1 film in China this year is called Hi Mom, which is about a woman who goes back in time and befriends her teenaged mother or early 20s mother as a fellow young woman, very sentimental. #2 is Chinatown Detective 3. They're also going for endless sequels. #3 is The Fast and the Furious 9, a foreign film. #4 is King Kong versus Godzilla. So no, in the top 4 so far this year, nothing from the propaganda machines. #5, Cliff Walkers is political, and it's about communist agents in Manchukuo in the 1930s. Chinese Doctors Fighting the Pandemic is #7 so far. 1921, which was the one that got the most attention within China, is actually only #11 this year. And we know from past experience that these numbers are often inflated because they give away tickets. They sell them at discounted prices. They order party members, 90 million plus, to go see them with their families. So these numbers may be inflated. 1921 comes in at #11 behind something called Boonie Bears, the Wildlife, which is a children's animated film. So they're not taking China's box office by storm. Again, thanks to Ann Kokas in absentia for her contributions. And again, if you have questions, please send them to us at china@wilsoncenter.org. Xi Jinping, as you know, in a recent speech has called on China's propagandists and China's government to tell China's story more effectively, which I take it means to have China's self-assessments accepted as at face value worldwide, to tell China's story to make it more lovable and respectful. And so I'd like to ask both of you, in his desire to have this China story told, do you see any willingness to actually change Chinese goals or behavior to become more lovable? That's part 1 of the question. And then part 2 is, anticipating that your answer is probably going to be no, how much does China care about soft power really? It invests in it, it plans, it's very careful. And it does to some degree target the global South and developed economies differently. Yet it doesn't seem willing to adjust much. I sometimes have the sense that China would love to be loved if it's easy, but it will settle for silence. How high a priority is soft power vis-a-vis just getting what they want? Sort of a broad question, but maybe Maria, if we start with you and then Anne-Marie, your thoughts, and then we'll go to audience questions. Thank you.
Yeah, these are pretty big questions, but in terms of changing behavior or adjusting the actual actions, I guess, yeah, my answer is more on the no side. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of adjustment in behavior, especially, when we see such defensive rhetoric as, Anne-Marie just mentioned with the speech itself during the anniversary was, surprisingly defensive. But overall, I think Chinese external propaganda has had a defensive kind of tune to it. So that suggests that there's more about kind of protecting or defending Chinese interests versus promoting a certain kind of image or idea. So that's the first thing. And when it comes to how much they care about soft power, I think there's one of the biggest challenges is something that you also noted earlier, Robert, when it comes to knowing about feedback or actual response to these messages. The system of measuring or understanding the reaction to any of these soft power engagements is really it's not very effective at capturing it, because for the most part, it looks at scale of how many things have been done, how much Chinese media has distributed its content, for instance, or Confucius Institutes, how many events have they put out. But it's not so much about how do they actually affect public opinion or how do they change people's mindsets. So when I was interviewing the practitioners of soft power, for the most part, they didn't know how effective really what they're doing is on the ground, and they had very little way of knowing, because the system that tracks feedback is really tracking very superficial measurements. When it comes to trainings, it's about how many people are trained. There's a certain scale of training them, and then once they come in and out, that's kind of the job is accomplished. But they don't really know to what extent it's really shifting anything. So I think unless that's changed, it's almost impossible to really transform the way it's managed. But to change that, one has to, I guess, be open to receiving some critical or sensitive feedback, because if you open it up to actually collecting feedback, you might end up getting some, not so pleasant response. And for the most part, I don't think they're willing to do that, because that could be, getting some of these bureaucrats in trouble. So it seems like there's a status quo of kind of just collecting very superficial measures, very like scale oriented versus substance, and sticking to kind of that expansion. It's like the more we do, we should just be doing more. The more, the better. But is it really doing something, effectively? That's the question that I think a lot of these practitioners are also asking. I don't think most of them believe that they're extremely successful at soft power. So maybe a lot of it is just symbolically fulfilling the quotas and making appearances, but not so much actually, aimed at accomplishing a very specific result. So that's my observation.
And Maria, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that the party, we've got to talk about not say the Chinese or the CCP. We've got to talk about how it is under Xi Jinping. This is a very particular phase of propaganda. Pre-Xi Jinping in the Hu Jintao era or Jiang Zemin era, they definitely had the smiling face style of propaganda work. And although Joseph Nye says that what China and Russia does is not soft power, so I actually really don't like to use that to describe what China is doing. China put that label, they adopted the term from about 2007, but Nye says it doesn't meet the definition of what he's talking about, which is attractive power. That's just there, like France, we love their culture, or Japan, we love their manga and their sushi. New Zealand, you love our scenery. China does, innately have soft power, but what the CCP does is separate again. And so that while the recommendation came out recently to show a softer and kinder face and external messaging, we're simply not seeing that. What we're seeing again and again are very harsh messages on every level. The wolf warrior on messaging on Twitter or at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs press statements is very famous now. But you find it even at the micro level. Just in my town, and our local newspaper had a very harsh letter from the Consul General rebutting any allegations about China engaging in malicious cyber activity. New Zealand has joined in with a number of other countries speaking out against that. The embassy also made strong statements about that. And of course they would defend themselves, but what we see continuously now is the very defensive and aggressive messaging. We are not seeing the smiling face style anymore. And that's the downside of Xi Jinping having eradicated all opposition, as he has done from 2012 on, and turning the party media organizations into the voice of the party again. Because under Jiang Zemin in the 90s, that was rephrased to that the media is the voice of the people. And so it was much more responsive to public opinion. It was more tailored to think about, what will be the impact of this message. So the CCP in the 90s and 2000s there was a lot of research done by academics, and it was listened to, and it was a much more, I think, effective approach than has been now followed under Xi Jinping. And so I think that that's an increasingly a very strong and aggressive message. And it is having the effect internationally in creating a very negative public opinion about China, and many states looking to defend them against China, and finding very few things that they can work with on. And, you know, we don't know, we can't poll the Chinese population anymore. It used to be possible. So we really don't know how Chinese people feel about this very harsh messaging. But all I can say about that, though, is that previous research done by academics in China was that the public did not like micro control, that macro control was macro management of media and communication. It was a much more effective long-term strategy for the party.
Related question, the first audience question, Anne-Marie, from Anne Moyson, who asks, there is concern about China buying influencers, especially in the West, in politics, lobbyists, business, and think tanks. How impactful or effective do you think that approach is?
Buying influence. Well, the party talks about borrowing a boat and buying a boat in terms of getting a foreign platforms, for example, buying into China, CCP connected companies, buying buying international media companies, or putting shares into those companies, whether it's radio or film or television. So the party has regarded that as and newspapers too, as a very effective way to get its message across, in addition to all the other ways in which it shares its message, the Chinese government's own media. So it's a multi-platform approach, and we're seeing now how social media is very important. It used to be that all the Western social media is blocked in China, but now the party is also very active on Western social media too. So there is a effort to, as there is in all, as I said, with all technology will be incorporated into the modernized propaganda system, the CCP would like to be on all available platforms to get its message across, because that's sort of standard thinking of Shinto's saturation approach.
Maria, a question for you. This one's anonymous. What are the consequences for an African country if it can't pay off a Chinese loan or won't relinquish its collateral? Rather than having a full BRI conversation, maybe we could put that in the context of today's discussion. How much goodwill does China get through its infrastructure lending in China, in Africa, and how much can that turn bad? How much ill will does it get if projects sour either on quality or on inability to repay? How do all of those efforts play into China's image building in Africa?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this question is, this image building effort is quite contentious. On the one hand, it is at the core of its image building, the infrastructure projects and their very physicality. I mean, throughout major cities in Africa is just very visible and very obvious to anybody that China is extremely present there and embedded into the local society. But at the same time, as I had mentioned earlier, that these projects are not always taken with a positive attitude by local citizens. In countries that are more authoritarian, like Ethiopia, the citizens don't have as much of a say. So even though they might not agree with these projects, they kind of have to subscribe to them. But in other countries, there have been protests, and like in Kenya, for instance, South Africa, there have been a lot more engagements through the media and civil society that kind of oppose or critique some of these arrangements. So I think it's really a mixed picture. It's not automatically buying influence or winning in soft power. It's buying, I think, in some ways, influence of elites. But it's much less so obvious to what extent it's really ends up shaping the public opinion at large in a positive direction. But the question is whether or not they care. I mean, the Chinese side cares about this public opinion, or if they only care about elites. Because if it's just elites, then it seems to work better than for the broader public. But if it is about the broader public and this idea of soft power is changing minds and hearts, then it's working much less effectively.
Okay,
excuse me, Robert, I'm going to have to dip out now. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. It's been
we will
really
have you back
again.
Have you back again soon. Thank you for getting out of bed so early.
Nice to see you, Anne-Marie.
Lovely to see you, and thanks very much to Ray and Trion for your work in backing this up.
We have a question now from John Owen. which had actually been slated for Anne-Marie, but she's got to go, so I will take this one. I'm comfortable with this one. He asks, a couple of years ago, I visited the Museum of the War of Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression in Beijing. And I was struck at the overwhelming message of that museum, that the party was the only real defender of China during the war, and that the party was the only legitimate representative of the Chinese nation today. How successful is this message within China? Does the party's public mostly accept the party's claim, or is it too difficult to tell? So on claim number one, that only the Chinese Communist Party defended China during the war, during World War II, the Japanese invasion, that has actually shifted considerably over the past 15 years or so, and there's been growing recognition of what the nationalists, who in fact were the government of China at the time, under Chiang Kai-shek, working with the United States and other allies, did to fight the Japanese. It is the People's Republic of China's telling of that wartime history still differs from the telling in Taiwan or the telling in the United States. It is seen in those places as overemphasizing the contribution of the communists, who mostly fought guerrilla battles against the Japanese and benefited from Chiang Kai-shek's depleting a lot of his resources in fighting Japan. In fact, Mao Zedong famously said that if it weren't for the Japanese invasion, he probably would have been wiped out in the caves at Yan'an. I'm not sure that line of Mao's was used during the centenary very much. So it's been changing. There's been more recognition of the things that Chiang Kai-shek and some of the nationalists achieved. At the same time, the message that only the Chinese Communist Party can legitimately represent the Chinese nation today, that one, of course, has not changed. In fact, that message is stronger than ever under Xi Jinping. China has also been building even more museums, not just the museum that you went to in Beijing. There's a museum up in Heilongjiang outside of Harbin, where the Japanese, during the invasion, conducted vivisections and other experiments, biological and chemical weapons, on Chinese citizens. There are new museums down in obscure parts of southern China, in Yunnan province. Ray Zhong and I visited them a few years ago. A brand new state-of-the-art museum, for example, on the building of the Burma Road. And that was a fairly important part of World War II. But down the street from that museum in Rayli, there's another museum which can in many ways rival those of the Smithsonian, to commemorate the Chinese of the Southeast Asian diaspora who returned to China during World War II to serve as auto mechanics on the trucks that went on the Burma Road. Now, good for them, but that seems like a fairly obscure topic for a big museum. The goal of the museum seemed again to be to promote, the party's fight against the Japanese, and also, frankly, to increase suspicion about what Japan had done and is doing. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Stanley Kober, and I'll put this to you, Maria. One subject you haven't discussed is the presence of so many Chinese students here and the opening up of China to the West, the willingness to send Chinese students overseas. Is there any indication that the party is reconsidering that policy?
Well, I don't think there's an indication of reconsideration of the policy, but there are struggles, I think, even on the US side of allowing for the students, right, to come in. I've seen recent statements that don't seem to be a dramatic shift from the Trump era just yet. So I think the restrictions that they're facing is more on the US side. I haven't seen statements from China that are, limiting students from leaving. But to what extent this leaving and immersing in global society, whether it's the US or Europe, changes the minds and perceptions of the students, I think that's the bigger question. And the existing studies suggest that actually there's more nationalism that ends up sort of accelerating and exasperating as part of these experiences, as some of these students discover that the US, of course, is not perfect. It's got many faults and problems, and they're very visible and experiential for them. So once they see that, I think the image of the US also shifts. And for some, they become actually more patriotic. And it's actually a very similar experience in a different way for students and volunteers to go to Africa. For after some time of living in Africa, many of them have reported that they come back somewhat more appreciative and patriotic of what China has accomplished, because they see just so many problems and such a long way towards developmental success that they've experienced. And in China, they think, well, actually, maybe things are not that bad in China, despite the restrictions that they face and critique. So it's interesting to kind of think about these experiences overseas. Do they really shift or fundamentally reshape how young people think about their home country, in this case China, or is it something that actually makes them in some ways maybe align closer to China? I think that's a really interesting ongoing debate. We don't have very conclusive evidence yet, but some suggestions are actually more towards nationalism versus pro-Western or more democratic views.
Well, and we will continue at the Kissinger Institute to track this question of higher educational relations between the United States and China, and how they're changing. They've been changing quickly over the past year. And so look for other programming on that. Maria Repnikova, thank you once again for contributing your expertise to the Wilson Center. Thanks also to Anne-Marie Brady and Ann Kokis, to Trian Burgess and Tracy Fitzgerald for their work, and always to Ray Jung, who makes all this stuff happen behind the scenes. Thanks to all of you for listening this afternoon. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.